Good morning. My name is Mel Hartley and I'm the Senior Communications and Regulation Officer at the Training Accreditation Council, and I'd like to welcome you to the workshop on making an assessment decision. This forms part of the Training Accreditation Council's education program. This webinar is number 3 in a series of 4 on assessment and provides RTOs with practical information to support the use of assessment tools to gather good evidence, make valid assessment judgments with that evidence, and record the evidence and outcomes. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. I would like to introduce Russell Docking, who is our presenter for today. Russell has been an auditor at TAC for a number of years and is well acquainted with the standards and is a guru on assessment. Thanks, Russell.
This workshop is going to be drawing on a number of resources, and I'll just draw your attention to them at the beginning so that at any time you might need to access them. One is the pre-session reading, which is handout number 1, and it basically provides you with some background to competency-based training and assessment, in particular competency-based assessment. In a sense, it encapsulates much of what we've talked about in the previous 2 sessions, and it is also going to be relevant to the 4th session when we look at assessment validation in some time in the future. And we'll touch on that when we finish our session today. And I'll walk you through the pre-reading very quickly when we start. There's a number of activities. There's activity 1, which it looks at traditional ways of looking at making assessment decisions, and activity 2, which looks at some alternative ways of looking at assessment decisions. The assessment decision itself is a very critical part of the assessment process. And we know that competency-based assessment is a 2-stage process. One is gathering evidence, and the second is making a judgment on the basis of that evidence. And when one looks at the literature, most of the literature is about gathering the evidence. And of course, the rules of evidence, which we'll touch on today, provide us with guidance as to how we should go through that process of gathering evidence. And indeed, that was the topic of the previous workshop. But the other part is then making the judgment on the basis of that evidence. And so our focus today is on the assessment judgment process, the assessment decision process that you need to go through. And so we will be looking at all of that from the perspective of a competency-based approach, and we'll be reflecting on that competency-based approach when we touch on the pre-reading. I need to also say that I'm aware of the fact that many of you, indeed I suspect most of you, are not working within the Training and Accreditation Council jurisdiction. Working with other regulatory authorities, either with the ASQA or in Victoria. And it really is important that you know that what we're sharing with you today is in part directly related to the standards, and therefore is mandatory across all the different jurisdictions, or is related to advice that TAC provides, either through its fact sheets, and through its series of education programs. And under those circumstances, you would need to look at your own regulatory authority in order to get their advice. But what we are sharing with you today is always going to be consistent with the standards and always going to be a form of best practice. That's not to say it's the only way things can be done, but it is one way that will certainly meet the requirements of the standards effectively. What we'll be looking at are a number of things. First of all, why we need to be competency-based, and that is looking a bit at the pre-reading. Who are making the assessment decisions, and so there we need to talk about assessors, how the decision is made, and we need to contrast their traditional forms of judgment, such as grading and task-oriented judgments, to focus more on competency-based judgments, because we are embedded in a competency-based system. And then finally, what records we need to keep And again, to a large extent, the standards are not precise or in many cases silent about what resource records need to be kept, but we will need to reflect on what is good practice in terms of keeping records. And again, there is a TAC fact sheet that relates to advice on keeping records. So if we look at our topics for today, we're going to touch first on the pre-reading, the need for high quality assessment practices, and we're going to touch on quality criteria for assessment. Those are in the pre-reading. And then we get into the meat of the workshop, which is making the assessment judgment, keeping assessment records, and we're going to reflect on assessment appeals, which provides us with a nice pathway into the fourth and final workshop, which looks at assessment validation, because assessment appeals is one source of evidence that assessment validation is necessary. When we talk about the need for high quality assessment practices, there is growing evidence that the competency-based approach to training and assessment is not only producing high quality training, but it's also leading to high quality assessment judgments. And I was interested to read some time ago of a report about the statistics relating to driver's licenses, and in relation to that, the rate of accidents and the rate of deaths amongst young drivers in the age range of 16 to 21. And there was a dramatic fall in the number of accidents, about a 50% fall in accidents, and about a 25% fall in deaths once competency-based assessment was incorporated within the driver license process. Now, that could be due to other factors as well. But what we are seeing, though, is that across the board in a number of different industry areas, and including that one, that there are high levels of safety, high levels of competence, and high levels of industry satisfaction. So it really is worth putting the effort into this, and it does mean that the effort that we put into making assessment judgments really matters. When we look at the pre-session reading, you'll find that in the first page, there is a discussion about the fact that all RTOs, whether they be assessment only or assessment and training, offer or require quality assessments. And so there's a little narrative on the bottom of the first page that talks about that. On the second page, you'll see a definition of competency. And under the definition, it talks about the key words in the definition: consistency, application, knowledge, skill, workplace standard, and transfer. And all of these also have a bearing not only on the design of the assessment tools, which we've covered before, but also the judgment that we're making. Then there's an issue discussion of resources and time that fundamentally under Standard 3.1, there is a need for, beg your pardon, 1.3, there's a need for adequate resources for delivery and assessment. There's a requirement in the standards for industry relevance, so our judgments and our assessment judgments that we make need to be consistent with what you would expect to lead to meaningful evidence of competence for the workplace. So industry relevance becomes really important when it comes to making a judgment. We need to make judgments that are responsive to individual needs, and indeed the standards require us to be flexible and fair, but overriding flexibility and fairness is validity. So there has to be quality in the judgment we make, but we need to make sure our judgment process is flexible and fair. And then we talk about the quality of assessment tools and judgment, which reflects then on the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment, which are discussed in the handout. But all of this has to be done by someone who has competence and qualifications to be able to do this. And it comes down to the fact that only RTO assessors can actually make assessment judgments. So clauses 113 through to 120 basically reflect on the qualities that you need to have in order to be able to make an assessment judgment. It's interesting to note that clause 1.17 basically says that if you're under supervision You can do more or less everything, but the one thing you can't do is make an assessment judgment. And so the concept of being competent and ready and prepared to make an assessment judgment is fairly clearly defined, that there are only certain people who can do it. And those people are qualified assessors, and assessor requirements are laid out in the standards. So if you see here, there are a whole bunch of requirements. Either you've got the current certificate for in training and assessment or its equivalent, or you have a diploma or higher level qualification in adult education, or you have the assessor skill set. All of these are set out for you in Schedule 1 of the standards for RTOs, so that you can see that information there as to what qualifies. But also you need to be vocationally competent. This is picked up under Standard 113A. That basically means that you either have the competencies that you're assessing or you have equivalent competence, keeping in mind that when a new unit of competency comes into being, nobody has it, and therefore, in a sense, nobody can teach it or assess it, unless, of course, we accept the concept of equivalence as a basis for operating with this delivery and assessment of that unit. So vocationally competent means you've got the unit, or you can establish you have equivalent competency. You have current industry skills, which means you understand how industry utilises the competency, how the competency works with other competencies within industry to lead to productive outcomes. And therefore you can understand not only what you need to do in terms of delivery, but you can also understand what your assessments have to predict. Fundamentally, when we certificate a person as competent, we are saying they are work ready. We're not saying that they are ready to start thinking about work. No, they are ready to do the work. So we are making a very strong statement about the industry readiness of a graduate, which means our assessment processes must be very conscious of what industry wants, what industry needs. So that is why we need to make sure our assessors are industry skilled. And in particular, the word that's not on the screen, but it is in the standards, is current industry skilled. Having skills from industry from the past might be interesting, but it's your graduates are going out into current industry, and so it's that current industry awareness that really is critical. And the third thing is that you need to have current vet skills and knowledge. That means you need to participate in webinars like this, but it also means that you are keeping up to date with how a vet is evolving. And I do want to stress the vet is evolving. The vet of today is not the vet of a decade ago or of 2 decades ago, and it's certainly not the vet of 40 years ago. It is an evolving area, because the more we do, the more we learn, the better we get at doing it. So there is a fact sheet on vocational competence and industry currency, and I just want to draw your attention to the fact that once again, TAC has provided additional resources and advice in relation to how you make sure that you can achieve these requirements and how you can demonstrate that you've achieved these requirements. So we have assessors who have a very specific role. One of those specific roles is that they can make assessment judgments. And we have others involved in assessment processes who play other roles. And so this next slide illustrates for you that there are, in fact, 2 different kinds of roles. They may be all performed by the same person. In other words, the assessor can also be the evidence gatherer, but sometimes the evidence gatherer is someone other than the assessor. But you notice that the assessor bookends the process. That is, the assessor develops the process through assessment mappings and designing the assessment tools and manages the evidence gathering process. And then the assessor at the other end of the process collates or gathers or accumulates the evidence, makes an assessment judgment on the basis of the evidence, reports the assessment outcomes, and participates in assessment validation, because they themselves are being validated. Under standards 1.9 through to 1.11, that process of systematic validation of assessments incorporates the validation of the assessor's own work themselves, as well as the evidence gatherers. Sitting between those two ends, if you like, sits the evidence gathering process. This can be done by the assessor, or it might be done by some other person, such as a supervisor in the workplace. Because the evidence gatherer is not making a judgment, they do not have to meet the requirements of an assessor. They would need to understand what they were supposed to do when it comes to gathering evidence. And that might mean, and usually means, that they have vocational competence themselves, that is, they are industry skilled themselves, because they need to understand the language and terminology and so on of the assessment tools that the assessor has created. But their function is to be observers, to gather evidence, and to report that information to the assessor. But they also need to participate in assessment validation. That basically is because they are part of the assessment process, then their work as an evidence gatherer will also need to be validated. So that evidence gatherer, sometimes called an observer, sometimes it's a workplace assessor. Well, if we say workplace assessor, we have to be very careful that we don't think that they're an assessor, so we best call them workplace observer. Their role is managed and monitored and supported by the assessor, who has overall responsibility for the whole process. But in terms, and we've talked about that before when it comes to designing assessment tools, but now when we come to look at the judgment process, the assessment decision that has to be made, then we need to understand that that role is preserved for the assessor and is not one that can be handed off to anybody else. So there are two kinds of judgments that you have to make as an assessor. And the first one is, in fact, a critical one, because we need to first judge, is the evidence itself evidence that we can use? Is it credible evidence? And any evidence that is not credible, we need to discard. There's no point in saying lots of bad evidence equals some good evidence. Bad evidence is bad evidence. If it doesn't meet the rules of evidence, it simply cannot be used. And under those circumstances, it gets discarded. It mustn't be used in any way, because that could colour our second judgment, which is there sufficient credible evidence to convict the learner of being competent beyond reasonable doubt? Well, you may find that phraseology slightly strange, but when you think about it, what we have is a kind of quasi-legal kind of arrangement. We're talking about evidence which is being used by an assessor as a judge to make a judgment as to whether or not a person is or is not competent. Notice the concept there of reasonable doubt, because fundamentally we have to ask ourselves the question, how much evidence do we need to gather in order to be able to make a safe judgment? And in some circumstances, it's a significant amount of evidence. In the case of hospitality, for example, we may need to observe a person over a vast number of cycles of delivery of a service in, say, a restaurant or a cafeteria. Under those circumstances, sufficient evidence is an enormous amount of evidence. And in other circumstances, we may be able to make a judgment on the minimum amount of evidence. We have already said in previous workshops that when it comes to skills, 2 would be the minimum amount of evidence, or 2 observations would be the minimum, partly because the definition of competency includes consistency, and you can't judge consistency on the basis of 1 bit of evidence. It includes transfer, so you can't see that a person has transferred a skill on 1 bit of evidence. So the word sufficient in good practice means 2. And pretty well all units of competency will use the words at least 1. And if it says at least 1, then 2 fits. But most or many units of competency are now saying more than 2 and are defining perhaps a specific number of clients or a particular number of cycles of the service or the competency or the skill. So what you can see there is that there's those 2 judgments for you to make. The first is the evidence acceptable, and the second is, does this evidence tell us that this person, beyond reasonable doubt, is guilty of being competent? let's look at the first one in a bit slightly more detail. And none of this will be unfamiliar to you. I know that you're very comfortable with this, but we need to keep going back to the rules of evidence. This is particularly true when the evidence is evidence that we didn't gather directly ourselves. So, for example, if we're involved in recognition of prior learning leads to an assessment judgment, which leads ultimately to the award of a statement of attainment or even ultimately to a qualification. We need to know, and it specifically says in Standard 1.8, that all assessments, including RPL, must meet the rules of evidence. So fundamentally, these rules apply to any evidence that you are going to use to make an assessment judgment. So you need to know that the evidence is valid. That is, it must truly reflect the requirements of the unit. And so discard any evidence that it does not truly reflect the unit requirement. We need to know the evidence is current. So if it's not current, if we don't have evidence that this is evidence of their current skills or performance, then we would have to reject that evidence. If the evidence was not necessarily authentic, if we can't be certain that it's the student's own work, if the evidence is based on some take-home assignment that could have been done by somebody else, or for that matter now, an artificial intelligence bot may have done the work. We need to know that it is the student's own work and not some artifice that comes from either another student, someone else in the workforce, or for that matter nowadays, artificial intelligence. Authenticity is important, and if we don't know that it's authentic, we must discard the evidence. And sufficient. So fundamentally, when we've chucked out everything that doesn't relate to the unit, chucked out everything that is not necessarily safe in terms of currency, chucked out everything that is not authentic or where we can't be certain that it's authentic. Well, what have we got left? Is there sufficient evidence to be able to make a judgment that the person has really demonstrated this quality in a consistent way that is transferable? Because if we don't have sufficient evidence, then we have to suspend our judgment until we do. So fundamentally, if we don't have enough credible evidence, we need to fundamentally do what is the obvious thing, which is to gather more evidence. Now, you'll note that in this slide we say, if there is time. So fundamentally, we are aware of the fact that you do not have an unlimited amount of time. The course might be running over a semester and the time might be running out, in which case you're going to have to make a judgment which says not yet competent. Notice that language is not yet competent, which could be that they haven't yet acquired competence or that you haven't yet acquired evidence of competence. But what you are saying, you're not saying they're incompetent. What you're saying is we still don't know. Because there's not enough credible evidence to be able to make a judgment. You can only say a person is competent when you have enough credible evidence, or for that matter, make a judgment that they're not competent when you have enough credible evidence that shows that they're not. So you have that situation where a person's kind of in limbo because there's not enough evidence. If there's enough time, then conduct some targeted evidence gathering. I need to stress here that targeted evidence gathering process needs to be conscious of the way in which a unit of competency is structured. So, for example, if they've demonstrated evidence of an aspect of an element, such as a performance criterion, the targeted evidence will not be just that performance criterion. It'll have to be all the components of that element. So you would look at gathering more evidence about the element, and in the process be gathering evidence about its constituent performance criteria. But you can't treat performance criteria as separate, isolated entities. They are performance criteria which define the performance of the element and need to be seen together. So the word targeted here needs to be understood to be targeted without invalidating the assessment process. When it comes to knowledge, you can target specific bits of knowledge. You don't need to reassess the whole knowledge test because each item of knowledge is an item which has value in its own right. So you could be looking for extra evidence of elements, extra evidence of knowledge, extra requirements in terms of performance evidence, targeted in that sense. You may actually also be able to look for evidence from other units of competency. And what that does mean is that you may not have seen it in the competency that they were performing, but if there was another competency that they were being assessed in, then it may be possible that you can see that there. But you do need to make sure that it is the same quality. So, for example, you might have shutdown and cleanup in the terms of a bit of equipment, and there might be shutdown and cleanup in terms of another bit of equipment. Although the two elements are worded the same, they are in fact different because they relate to different bits of equipment. So we have to be very careful here that we do not, in the process of looking for evidence in other units, make the mistake of imagining that because they simply have the same words, they are therefore the same competency. You have to go back to the unit of competency, and then you would recognise that it was talking about a different context, a different bit of equipment. The shutdown procedures would be different, even though the language of the unit was the same. So, yes, you can look for evidence from other units, but you have to make sure that what you're looking for is exactly the same quality as you are missing from the evidence that you need to make your decision. Or finally, you might simply defer judgment, and you might think about supplementing assessment in the next unit. So what you might say is, well, I can't make a judgment now, but I could arrange for further assessment next time you're doing some training, which would enable us to close the gap. And under those circumstances, what you are doing is saying, well, I'm only interested in the end of the day in evidence. I don't mind how you get to become competent. You may become competent over the holidays. You may become competent through further training in another unit. But at the end of the day, if I have all of the credible evidence I need, then I'm able to make a safe judgment. So let's imagine now that we've got the evidence in. And we're going to just do a little activity now, which gives us a chance to think about what you can do with the evidence when you gather it. For this exercise, I'm using a training and assessment unit of competency called Contribute to Assessment. It's kind of ironic, isn't it, really, that we're talking about assessment and I've picked a unit relating to assessment. I hope you don't find that confusing. But we're not going to spend time looking at the unit of competency, but it's there if you want to as a reference point, because you'll see later on that we do get into the detail. What I want you to imagine in activity one is that we've actually done the job. We've been to our previous workshops and we've done the job of creating a number of performance assessments. Let's call them performance assessment 1, performance assessment 2, and performance assessment 3. So if we could slip to the next slide, this is what activity 1 looks like. And what we've got is the unit of competency, Contribute to Assessment. There are a set of evidence gathering tools which have been developed, performance assessment 1, performance assessment 2, performance assessment 3. You would have seen that we developed those previously or discussed the development of those, and there was a knowledge assessment. So there are 3 assessments measuring the skills components, that is the elements and performance evidence requirements, and 1 assessment measuring the knowledge. And ABLOGS has done these assessments, and ABLOGS has achieved only 16 of the 17 criteria in performance assessment 1, 14 of the 17 in performance assessment 2. Obviously, ABLOGS is learning as he goes, because by the time he gets to 3, performance assessment 3, he gets 17 out of the 17 criteria. So he's looking pretty good. And when it comes to knowledge assessment, he gets 12 out of 12 items correct in terms of the knowledge test itself. And what I want you to do is to have a look at ABLOGS, and on the next page you'll see BLOGS, which is has a slightly different pattern of performance. And what I want you to do is to give some thought now to whether or not you would judge ABLOGS to be competent or not yet competent, and BLOGS, whether you would judge BLOGS to be competent or not yet competent. Thank you, folks, to have a chance to look at this. Tegan has asked a question, just going back to the earlier slides. I've seen some RTOs refer to and use the term co-assessor. However, should that be changed and instead the correct term being used, should it be evidence gatherer? I would argue that that's a good idea because I feel that you should be jealous of the word assessor. You should feel proud of and protective of the word assessor, rather than doling it out to other people as and giving the impression that they are assessors. Nonetheless, the word co-assessor means that they're a support act to the assessor. So I don't have a problem with it. Certainly the standards don't talk about this in this way at all. They do say what an assessor has to be able to do, and in that sense preserve the title of assessor to someone who has those qualities. I don't think it's misleading, but I would argue that evidence gatherer or observer would be a better term to use. But look, it's just an opinion and not one that you should feel stressed about. If your RTO is comfortable with your word co-assessor, then stick with it because everybody knows what it means. And that's a good way to work. When we look at A blogs and B blogs, and here we've got A blogs on the screen, A blogs ends up getting actually 77% of the criteria. They've got 49 of the 63 criteria. And with 77%, they would get a distinction at any Australian university. I might say B blogs, if we flip over to B blogs gets 52 out of 63, which is 83%. And if they were at the Australian National University, they would get a high distinction. And it's really interesting to reflect on the fact there's a document which I've pulled off the web, so it must be true, called Australian Grading System Explained, a complete guide. And what this does is give you, for each university across Australia, what the different grades mean. So there's high distinction, distinction, credit, what that means in terms of percentages, and so on. It's quite complicated because every university has its own scheme and they don't match up. So a high distinction in one place could be a distinction in another, and so that you have every state covered. And so and indeed they all have different letters and of the alphabet to work with. Ultimately, though, they get to VET, and VET is rather beautiful because VET says not yet competency. There's no percentage associated with it. Competent, 100%. Boom, that's it. Simple, straightforward, no mucking about. Everybody knows what it means. But if you go into the university sector and someone says, I've got a credit, you have no idea what that means. You'd have to go to this document, find out what a credit meant, and then if they were going to another university, it would have a very different meaning. So we have a situation where the concept of judgment in the university is all over the place. The concept of judgment for us is pretty straightforward. If you have a look at the judgment that you've been asked to make here, I would imagine that most of you would judge that A blogs and B blogs were not competent. And they were not competent because there were not satisfactory criteria. They weren't meeting 100% of the criteria. Neither of them did. Under those circumstances, you would say neither of them are competent. But the problem with that judgment, though, is that we don't know about the pattern of performance that they've demonstrated. Have we seen within the context of the evidence? I mean, all the evidence is being collapsed down into simple numbers like 10 out of 17 or 16 out of 17 or 10 out of 12. All of the evidence has been sort of compacted into a set of numbers. And what we've lost is the detail which enables to understand the qualities of A blogs and B blogs. So we actually haven't made a competency-based judgment. We've made a judgment on the basis of task performance rather than on the basis of competency performance. And that's because in the earlier sessions, quite rightly, we said the way you're going to see a person is competent is by getting them to perform tasks. And that's true. But the purpose of the task is not to get the task right. is to extract evidence of competence. And weirdly, you could imagine a circumstance where a person got the task wrong, but was still competent because the bits that are related to the competency were done successfully. And the bits that were not related to the competency were where the mistakes were made. So you understand that a task is not a competency. A competency is something you use within a task to be able to perform the task. So the analysis that this uses based on tasks is not sufficiently precise for us to make a good judgment. So let's have a look at some slides where we draw those points out. The first thing is, it could be said that if they've done everything right on the tasks, then all aspects of the competency must have been seen. So this is only going to be a problem if they don't perform all the tasks successfully. If they do perform the task successfully, no problem. The tasks were mapped to the unit, they performed the task successfully, the unit must have been demonstrated. Case closed. Already the person's guilty of being competent. We can relax. But if some tasks are unsuccessful, then we have to say, why were they not successful? What was the problem? If it related to the unit, they're not competent. If it was not related to the unit, then they could be competent. And we need to find out what's going on. So in the next slide, we ask you to think about further about this problem of the task. If an aspect of the task was the problem, should they repeat the whole task? Or could we ask them to do just the bit that they got wrong? Or could we look for new evidence of that competency somewhere else or somehow else? So we might be able to look for it in the workplace or in another unit of competency or in a role play or a simulation. We may be able to see it another way. If you see the evidence of competency elsewhere, how can you use it? Because you can't now say they can perform the task because you can't take that other evidence and somehow or other pop it into the task and turn the task into a success. In other words, that extra evidence that we've gathered can't use because it's, unless we get them to do the whole task again, which is not necessary, we can't use that extra evidence. What we need is competency-based judgment. What we need is a judgment where we say, have the tasks shown us that the person can perform the competency? And to do that, we have to break ourselves apart to think about it on a competency level. So the decisions we need to make need to be competency decisions. And competency decisions basically are saying we need to get evidence of competence, not evidence of tasks. Now that allows us to do things like unplanned evidence. In other words, if evidence comes in of competency that we were not expecting, that was not provided through a task, we need to be able to accept that because that is real evidence. We don't have to say, oh, no, I didn't see that happen. You did that well. That aspect of the competency was done beautifully, but I didn't see it because it wasn't in my task. That's just rubbish. A competency is competency wherever it's seen. Otherwise, we wouldn't have RPL. And it's the competency that's driving this, not the tasks that we invent. Indeed, different lecturers, different trainers, and different assessors will create different tasks for the same competency. So it's not the task that matters, it's the competency that matters. So we need to be able to allow for unplanned evidence or evidence that comes from sources that we are not ourselves devising. Then when we've got that evidence together, we can evaluate the quality of each item of evidence. So we can say, well, did I gather that evidence through a task or did I get that evidence from another assessor? I use the word assessor advisedly here, so I can trust the evidence that that person's gathered, or did I get that evidence from what was observed in the workplace? Does that meet the rules of evidence? Can I use it? We evaluate the quality of each item of evidence in relation to the unit requirements. We collate or gather the evidence together, having discarded the evidence we can't trust. Then we need to be able to map the evidence onto the unit requirements, which could mean that you write Johnny Smith or Abe Logg's name on the front of the unit, and then you could go into the unit and you could say, have I seen element 1? Have I seen element 2? Have I seen element 3 and so on? Have I seen the performance evidence requirements? Have I seen the foundation skills? You could do that. So you could have a piece of paper for each student, which is the unit of competency, and you could tick it off. But we have a better way of doing that, but that's mapping the evidence onto the unit requirements. We have a better way of doing that because in previous sessions, we did a mapping of requirements and tasks, which enable us to do what we need to do in terms of making a competency-based judgment. And then finally, we need to be able to gather any supplementary evidence, because what we are basically saying is when we've done a mapping of the evidence onto the unit requirements, either this way or the way we're going to illustrate in a moment, we might find gaps, and those gaps can then be used to define supplementary evidence that will enable us ultimately to make the final assessment judgment. So activity 2, is where we are going to look at making an assessment judgment. And you've been given in documentary form the same information as activity 1. I want to stress that it's the same information as activity 1. However, what you've now got is detail. You've got detail for A blogs of their performance against each of the requirements of performance evidence 1, performance evidence 2, and performance assessment 3, and knowledge evidence. You've got the detail. And that detail in the activity 2 page, which you've been sent, is mapped onto the very mapping that we used when we designed assessment tools in the previous session. So we haven't had to create a mapping. It already exists. You've already done it. All we've done is write into the mapping with ticks and crosses the record of A blogs and a record for B blogs. And what I want you to do is to look at the record of A blogs and look at the record for B blogs and make an assessment decision on the basis provided and see whether or not you reach the same conclusion. Remember that the rule is that they must demonstrate every element twice. That was a condition that we talked about previously. So they need to demonstrate every element twice. And if they've demonstrated an element twice, then we can say that element has been achieved. So have a look at that and see what you can do. Okay, folks, welcome back. I hope you had a chance, as I have, to grab a cup of coffee and to relax for a moment. I do need to stress that what we're about to share with you is not mandated in any sense. Well, it's a little bit mandated in the sense that you do have to make a competency-based decision. In other words, you do need to be able to say when you make an assessment decision that the person has or has not met the requirements of the unit of competency. Now, there is a presumption that if you've done a mapping in one form or another and created assessment tools that reflect the unit of competency, then successful completion of those tools means that the person's competent. And that would be true, as I said before. On the other hand, if there have been problems in succeeding with the tasks you've set, given that almost every time you create a task, it will be actually involve components that go beyond the competency, you have to make a very much more discerning judgment. You have to ask yourself the question, yes, they didn't perform the task, but what aspects of competency have I seen? So if we look at A blogs' record, here we're going to show you a slide where we've drawn some ovals around some components. You can see that with A blogs that they've demonstrated all of element 1 twice. And so the outcome for element 1, you can see there is a tick, and they've demonstrated element 1. But they haven't demonstrated all of element 2 twice. They've demonstrated all the performance criteria twice, but they haven't demonstrated the element twice. So performance evidence 1, assessment 1, and performance assessment 2 cover all of the performance criteria, but they haven't in either of those demonstrated all the performance criteria together. So they haven't actually demonstrated the element. So there's a cross in the outcome box. When we look at element 3, we can see that it's only been demonstrated once, and so a cross. When we look at element 4, we can see that the element has been demonstrated twice, therefore there's a tick. And then when we look at the performance evidence requirements, all the performance evidence requirements have been demonstrated except requirement 4, because they didn't demonstrate that 012 and 013. And when we look at the knowledge, they've demonstrated all the knowledge, but the ultimate judgment is across because, as you saw on the previous screen, there were a number of elements not seen the requisite number of times. So our judgment in relation to A blogs hasn't changed. They are still not yet competent. However, if we go back to the previous screen, you'll see that what we now know needs to be done is that we need to set up some assessment where we can see element 2 and element 3 again, because we don't need to see all the tasks performed again. We don't need to see all of performance assessment 1 or all of performance assessment 2. We can be quite focused now and say we need to see element 2 and element 3. And we may be able to see that in another unit, or we may be able to see that with another little activity, but we do not need to make them do the whole task again. It's not necessary because of the elements are standalone components, and we can look for those. Incidentally, if we see element 3 again, then we will also be seeing the requirements for reporting findings 3 times, so that we will be able to, actually that does mean, interesting point, it would mean that we would need to see aspects of element 4 again, because 012 and 013 are aspects of reporting. So we would need to basically say we need to see element 2 and element 3, and we need you to get to report your findings, and we can then say you're competent. So we can actually basically target for A blogs some supplementary assessment which will sort things out. So you can see there that not only is it precise in our judgment, and not only are we able to say exactly why A blogs has failed to demonstrate competence, we can also say precisely what A blogs needs to do, if there's time, in order to remedy the situation. When we look at B blogs, I'm not too sure I've got my copy of B blogs here. Yes, I do. When we look at B blogs, we can see quite a different story. B blogs has demonstrated element 1 twice. B blogs has demonstrated element 2 twice. B blogs has demonstrated element 3 twice and 4 twice, has met all the requirements. And if we look at the next page, we can see that B blogs has actually achieved competence. Now, this is different to the judgment you would have made when you looked at the tasks. At no time did B blogs do all the tasks successfully, but did B blogs demonstrate all the qualities of competence? The answer is yes, B blogs did. So here you can see that the judgment we made before was wrong, because in terms of what it is to be competent, we actually have seen it. And this kind of breakdown, this kind of analysis enables us to make a better judgment. So for a start, it's easy to do. This process of judgment here, if you go back to the previous slide, Mel, you can see all you've done is taken a mapping which you've already created, and you're simply now putting in with ticks and crosses what the evidence is producing for you. In the case of A blogs, we needn't go back, but in the case of A blogs, that pattern of ticks and crosses led to a judgment of not yet competent and provided us with guidance as to what needs to be done in terms of remedying the problem. In the case of B blogs, the pattern of ticks and crosses told us that this person is competent. And so we have a very easy process which enables us to make a safe judgment. It's easy for us to justify our decision. We can basically say to A blogs, yes, you've demonstrated a high level of performance, but these qualities are the ones that are missing. So we can justify our judgment with the precision that is necessary. We have assessed, in this case, with respect to unit requirements rather than our tasks, because the tasks are not what matter, it's the competency that matters. And it is easy for us to see gaps, as we did with A blogs. In your handout, you'll find an extra page, the benefits of mapping unit requirements to delivery resources and assessment tools. And it basically is saying this mapping, which we talked about in the previous session, now has added value. It's not just there to demonstrate that you meet standard 1.8 in terms of the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment, but it also adds value in terms of validation of your assessments under standard 1.9 through to 1.11. It provides guidance to the learner in terms of feedback and remediation. And indeed, if we look at the next slide, and the next one after that, thanks, Mel, what we can see here is just a few of the items. 2, 8, 15, 18 refer to 2, 8, 15 and 18 on this list. It means that at the end of the day, we have ensured that each unit of competency is handled separately for validation and assessment judgment, where units are clustered together. So if we have an assessment task which is measuring more than one unit, as often they do, then what we are able to say is, in relation to this unit, this is what the evidence is telling us. In relation to the other unit in the cluster, this is what the evidence is telling us. And so we are able to make separate judgments for assessment and, for that matter, for validation, where units are clustered together in the form of tasks. That's really important, because quite often when people create a cluster, they may end up making a cluster judgment. That is, they basically say you've got both units in the cluster, or you've got neither unit in the cluster. This enables you to make a unit-by-unit judgment, because you would have a mapping for one unit and you'd have a mapping for the other unit, and then you could make a judgment on each unit separately. And that's really what is necessary, because we're not cluster-based assessment, we're competency-based assessment. So we need to be able to make a judgment in relation to each competency. Mel.
Russell, I'm just going to go back to the activity just for a second. Just had a few comments. I'm just going to provide a little bit of clarification.
Yeah.
So ABLOGS is not compliant, because if you have a look here, and you can see on my, is there a pointer? No, hang on, here's a pointer. You can see here that although they have 2 ticks here, that means they've
demonstrated that element once.
That's right. 1 tick here.
So they haven't demonstrated that element.
That's right, and 1 tick here.
So they haven't demonstrated the element. So you have to get to see an element of competency, you have to see all its performance criteria together.
Yes.
And that is because the definition of the performance criteria. The performance criteria are those qualities that make up the element. As soon as you leave a performance criterion out, then you're not seeing the element, you're seeing something else. The imagery I often use is a cake is made up of all sorts of ingredients. If I say to a person, well, here is a cake, but I've left the flour out, is it a cake? No. If the next thing I make is a pizza which has flour in it, can I say I now have made the cake because the pizza has flour in it? The answer is no, because they still haven't got a cake with flour in it. And under those circumstances, you can't treat these performance criteria as you would separate ingredients. They're not separate ingredients. They must always be together. So in element 3, 3.1 and 3.2 have to happen together. Otherwise, the element hasn't happened. So you'll see that also with element 2. Element 2, taken together with the 2 performances, we've seen all the performance criteria, but we've only seen the performance criteria together once, which is in performance assessment 3. So we have to understand that you cannot treat these performance criteria separately.
That's right. So if this was a tick down the bottom here,
that would now be twice and would be okay. Yep. Now, when it comes to reassessing ABLOGs, we don't simply say, oh, well, now I need you to just write the resource requirements. I need to see 2.1, 2.3, 2.4, and 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and 2.4 performed again together. Otherwise, it'd be a bit like saying, look, I know I left the flour out of the cake, but that's fine. Here's a slice of cake and here's a cup of flour. Enjoy. You're not going to enjoy that cake because the flour has to be in the cake. So your supplementary assessment of element 2 has to be of the whole of element 2, not just the performance criterion that was missing. And that really, really is important in terms of our concept of competency. An element is defined by the presence of all its performance criteria. As soon as some of the performance criteria go, it is a different element. It is not the same element. And you can't just add a performance criterion in to make it the same element.
Mm-hmm.
So that really is crucial, and that illustrates for you very nicely, I think, the fact that competency when it comes to elements requires all the performance criteria to be seen together. So that's what that's illustrating there.
Okay, thanks for that, Russell. I'll take you back to here.
Okay, the second thing that we can see, and the second benefit that I've sort of listed in that page, those 2 pages of benefits, is that basically it provides the record of evidence gathered for a student across a number of assessments, including supplementary assessments and unprompted evidence. So fundamentally, if we saw a particular aspect of an element somewhere else, and indeed, if you look at B-blogs, the evidence for a bit of knowledge, if we go back to just one screen, that would be good if you could. You can see that B-blogs, question 3, B-blogs got wrong, but question 3, the rules of evidence, he was asked about that in another unit, which I've called unit XYZ. So I know he knows the rules of evidence, so I can tick it because I've seen that knowledge elsewhere. And when it came to question 7, I didn't have to get him to do the whole test of knowledge again. I can just pick these 2 bits out because they're independent bits of knowledge. When it came to question 7, different types of evidence, got that question wrong. So I had a little chat with him about it. And in that chat, he revealed that he did know different types of evidence. Maybe he didn't quite understand the question, or maybe he'd learnt something from getting it wrong and has since gone away and learnt it. So through oral questioning, I was able to change the record. I could not change the record like that if I had to go back and redo the whole assessment. What it's saying is evidence of competency, no matter where it comes from, as long as it meets the rules of evidence, is evidence. And so what you've got there is a situation. Can we move forward a slide now? Sorry, thanks. Where you are able to take evidence from supplementary assessments or even unprompted evidence, you can now incorporate this. In other words, wherever evidence occurs, it can be incorporated. I might say, by the way, and this is a point worth making, is that this mapping can also be used for RPL. So instead of PA1, PA2, PA3 and knowledge assessment, you could have different headings basically saying, well, I need evidence of these. You may, in fact, do PA1 because it's not a bad idea when it comes to RPL to administer your own assessment tools. But maybe instead of PA2 or PA3, you could then take evidence that they provided, which would be evidence that would either support or give you consistency and transfer. So what you can do is use this mapping to map evidence provided to you for RPL, which may include your formal assessments and it may include evidence of from other sources. In other words, this tool is useful for RPL. And the lovely thing about this tool, when it comes to RPL, is that you're making the same judgment on the basis of the same criteria. The evidence may be different, but the criteria will be the same, leading to the same judgment, which is crucial under standard 1.8. The third thing that we've listed in this selection from the pages is that it does provide the student with competency-based feedback. You're not saying to the student you failed the task. What you're saying to the student is there are aspects of competency which you need to work on. We are competency-based training. We are competency-based assessment. The feedback we need to give to students should not be task-based. It should be feedback based on competency, because that's the name of the game. So you are providing the student with feedback that is competency-based. And finally, when it comes to supplementary assessment, for example, with A blogs record, you can amend A blogs record on the basis of supplementary assessment. So supplementary assessment might look at element 2 and element 3 and bits of performance evidence. When you've done the supplementary assessment, you can write those outcomes into this matrix and now come to a different conclusion. Or if you're still having trouble with element 2 and element 3, come to the same conclusion. The point about it is that the outcomes from supplementary assessment can be recorded on the same tool so that you end up having a comprehensive record of what's happened with A blogs and what's happened with B blogs. So what we're trying to argue here is that everything here will lead to a process that means that you can make a defendable judgment. But it also supports the concepts of consistency, because you've got multiple indicators where it's necessary. Transfer, because you can make sure those indicators are based on different sources of evidence. Performance evidence 1 and performance assessment 2 and performance assessment 3 are different assessments. They're measuring the same thing, but they're different activities, and you can see that on the second page of each record. And sufficiency, that is, that you have met the requirements that the unit proposes, and in our case, in this case, good practice. The unit doesn't require 2 assessments, but we've put that requirement in because that way we can see consistency and we can see transfer. And that's really important in order to be able to say that we've seen competency. Yes, Mel?
Russell, I just want to go back to A blogs again, sorry.
Yep.
And please correct me, Tegan and Karen, if I am saying the right thing. It's actually performance evidence 3 we want to look at, where it's saying you need to conduct 3 assessment activities, which has been ticked as the outcome.
Yes.
But a cross is in here. Okay. Is that right?
So if you look at what they have done is 3 assessment activities. It doesn't actually say that anything about the quality of them. They must do 3 assessment activities. So they've done 3 assessment activities. It doesn't say successfully conduct 3 assessment activities. So they've been involved in 3 assessment activities. It's an interesting point to make, but they have conducted 3 assessment activities because they've been involved in PA1, PA2, PA3, but they haven't reported on those 3 activities. Look, sometimes it would be nice if they were a bit more precise in the performance evidence, but that's basically where it's going. They have been engaged in 3 assessment activities, immersed, if you like, in 3 assessment activities.
Thanks, Russell.
So now we get to what we do, assessment records. And I might say straight away, these are assessment records. These were originally planning records, records of planning, which were useful for being able to demonstrate that you met the rules of evidence and principles of assessment for standard 1.8. But now, by simply putting the name of the student on the top and then using this document to record the outcomes, you've turned this into an assessment record. And you can see that this assessment record would really be very valuable in terms of, first, making a judgment of competency. So in terms of student outcomes, we can say we've got a record here which enables us to say A blogs has passed, or it's demonstrated competence, and B blogs, beg your pardon, A blogs has not demonstrated competence, and B blogs has demonstrated competence. The second thing is, of course, when it comes to appeals and audits and litigation, what this does is provide you with a basis for either justifying your decision in the event of an appeal. So A blogs might well appeal your judgment on the grounds that they've demonstrated all the performance criteria twice. And what you have here is a record which shows, yes, you have demonstrated a lot of aspects of competency, but not in a pattern which is consistent with the concept of this competency. So it's the pattern of performance that's the problem, rather than the volume, if you like, of performance. If we were going to volume of performance, we would just be talking percentages. We're not. We're talking about patterns of performance and how those patterns of performance relate to the requirements of the unit of competency. So what you can see with these records is that you can defend your judgment in the context of an appeal. And just as an aside, you can also defend your requirement in terms of supplementary assessment in the event of an appeal. When it comes to audits, you can, of course, demonstrate your compliance in a number of ways, but this makes it easy for you to show that you have made a competency-based judgment. So if you're using tasks, they've done this task, they've done that task, and done this task, and they've all done those tasks successfully, we don't have a problem, because that clearly, if the tasks map, means that the person's competent. But if the person has not demonstrated a task, it becomes important in an audit context for the auditor to say, what is it about this task that the person didn't succeed with? And is that aspect an aspect of competency or just an aspect of the task and not necessarily an aspect of competency? So you need to be able to then dig in, and you need to be able to show the student's actual work to be able to show that the problem was with the competency and not with some other aspect. This record shows it clearly, whether the problem was with the task or with the competency. And the final thing is litigation. And of course, the standards are silent about this, but litigation is an issue you need to consider. What this does is protect your back in many ways. What it does is say, firstly, you've designed an assessment system that meets the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment. But secondly, it says, I've then utilised this plan to make judgments about this individual, which shows that I made a proper judgment against the standards of the day. In other words, it is your insurance in the event of potential litigation in the future. And it's something that is touched on in the TAC document on record keeping, because litigation is a situation that we have to face from time to time. And the evidence that you need to have is not just evidence that you made a judgment based on your impressions, but that you've made a judgment based on the unit of competency requirements, actual hard evidence that you gathered through various strategies. And notice that where the strategies deviate from your original plans, you annotate it so that you might say, oh, that was through oral assessment or that was from a different unit. That is not annotated. So it's understood how you exercised your responsibility as an assessor, and under those circumstances, you're not going to be at risk in terms of litigation. And of course, assessment validation, which comes under standards or clauses 1.9 through to 1.11. This is evidence not just that you have designed a good assessment tool and process, but that you're utilising the process appropriately, including, as we've seen before, drawing on evidence from sources other than those that were part of your original plans. And that means that your assessment validation is not just looking at how you designed your assessment strategies and tools, but how you used your assessment strategies and tools. So you can see there that assessment records need to be kept in order to be able to show how you reach student judgments and outcomes. They need to be available to support appeals and to help you to defend your judgments in the context of an appeal or an audit or a litigation or assessment validation. And so if we look at the next slide, you can see that there are a number of records that you need to keep. And this is in a fact sheet, the records management fact sheet. And this is just advice. I need to stress here that the standards themselves are fundamentally silent when it comes to this. There is a requirement that some records of qualifications issued are kept. And to some extent, that's already covered through other systems, such as USI. But there is nonetheless a need for you to be conscious of the fact that you do need to keep records to protect you and to protect your RTO. I say protect you because when you make an assessment judgment, it is the assessor making the assessment judgment, not the RTO. So the assessor's judgment is a personal judgment made by you as an assessor. And so the protection is there for you as well as for the RTO. So it is recommended, but not mandated, that signed and dated assessment plans and records for all students. So you can see that this document that we've invented has an opportunity for a student to sign to at least acknowledge that what this is that they've seen the record, so to speak. Relevant assessment tools, because after all, who knows what PA1, PA2, PA3 and KA stand for, you would need to keep a copy of them, and it would need to be just one set because you just need to be able to say, well, this is what PA1 means, this is what PA2 means, PA3 means, and what the knowledge assessment means. You don't need to keep an assessment tool for every student because you've already extracted from the tool the evidence and written it into the record. But you do need to keep an example of each tool, one set per cohort, and until the tools change, that set of tools can be just kept as an illustration of what these things mean. You need to keep, nonetheless, a small sample of completed assessment tools so that you can show that your extrapolation of the evidence from the tool into the record was a valid and appropriate one. And that needs to be kept just until the next validation event. And given that the validation events might occur certainly within a 5-year period, you don't need to keep these tools forever. You only need to keep these tools for a short time. I've seen RTOs with containers full of samples of welding, student welding, each carefully labelled and stacked away in the case that they need to extract this information. If you've seen them perform a particular skill or whatever, you extract the evidence from the performance of that skill, you put it into a document which can be kept as a document or in digital form, and then you need to be able to keep that information so that you can see, well, what do we derive from that? If they're doing some cooking, you don't have to refrigerate samples of the food that they cooked or freeze. You extract from that the evidence and then keep the completed assessment tool, which in this case would be an observation tool, and the record. And that way, when it comes to validation, you'd be able to demonstrate that that process of extraction and record keeping was done validly. And then finally, if you're using a tool like this or any other tool for RPL, you'd keep a record of the processes that you use. Now, this is not just the evidence. This is the process through which you manage the evidence, so that you already covered above is the evidence that you would need to keep. And again, if you're using a tool like this for RPL, then what this will have is a lot more in the comments section because it'll be annotated. And so in the comments section, there'll be a lot of annotations indicating where the evidence was coming from, but also judgments in terms of how you made judgments as to whether the evidence was credible or not. In our, not in this series, but in a recent workshop, which is probably now online, when we looked at RPL, we had a little chart which you could use there to look at the evidence being provided by the applicant for RPL, analyse the evidence in terms of the rules of evidence, decide if the evidence was adequate enough to be able to, or in terms of its qualities to use, or if not, to discard, look at what kind of supplementary evidence might be needed, and then keep a record of the evidence and the supplementary evidence, and finally the judgment. Very much like this, based on unit requirements. So RPL processes need to be preserved. They change from time to time, and so you need to make sure that you can be able to say in the event of a litigation or an appeal that you followed proper processes for RPL. So fundamentally, this is advice. The fact sheet is there on the screen, and you can access that in digital form, or you can print your own copy for recognition of prior learning and for records management. All of that information is available as fact sheets through the TAC website. When it comes to assessment appeals, what we are seeing in reality is that there are very much fewer appeals now than there used to be. When it was possible to fail a person for getting 49%, the argument quite legitimately be made by a student, well, how come I didn't get one more mark, 50%, and then be a pass? I mean, that distinction between 49% and 50% was the distinction between fail and pass, a life-changing distinction. You can imagine that there are lots of appeals. Also in those days, when we had percentages, and then there were not necessarily competency standards. So it came down to very much a judgment by the assessor as to what they should assess from all that was being taught and what value to give to each component of assessment. And so you say this question's worth 3 marks, this question's worth 5 marks, this question's worth 1 mark. All of those were totally subjective judgments. They were not based on any kind of really meaningful analysis. What we now have is a competency standard which says these are the performance criteria that make up an element. When you've seen those performance criteria, you've seen the element. It's not 4 of the, it's not 80% of them, all of them. When I've seen all those performance criteria, I've seen the element. When I've seen all the elements and all of the foundation skills and all of the knowledge requirements, I have seen the unit and I can award the unit. It's much more black and white. It depends much less on a subjective judgment about what to assess, what standard is required, what constitutes a pass or a fail. All of those things, all of those subjective judgments have been removed by the creation of units of competency and their components. Doesn't mean that all subjectivity is gone, but it means that those things which often led to appeals have vanished. And as a consequence, we're seeing far fewer appeals. And so we basically want to be able to try to minimise the likelihood of an appeal through managing our work with competency-based assessment effectively. So the first thing is to create a valid assessment plan. To minimise the likelihood of appeals, you need to plan your assessment process well. We've talked about that in previous sessions, right back to session 1, when we looked at assessment systems, and session 2, when we looked at developing assessment tools. If we do those processes properly, then we're less likely to have appeals. We need to explain competency-based assessment to students. Many of our students have not been immersed in the competency-based world up till now. So if they've been coming to us directly from school, or dare I say from university, they'll be coming from a graded system. And they may not understand competency-based assessment well. I have to say that again and again I read brilliant explanations of competency-based assessment in student handbooks developed by RTOs. I really think RTOs are managing this concept very well and beginning to explain it very well to students. But part of the reason that a student might appeal is because they just don't get it. And so effort that you put into explaining competency-based assessment to the students ahead of time is well worth doing. It can be done in an induction, can be done through a student handbook. It can be done unit by unit. So I've been looking at some units recently, or some assessment tools recently, where the preamble to the assessment tool explains how the assessment tool relates to competency and what your expectations are. And that means everybody understands what is expected. Make sure that each student understands and agrees to the assessment plan. Again, quite often, students just don't know how they're going to be assessed. And so get them to understand what competency-based assessment is, share with them this assessment plan. And you see that in learning and assessment plans and learning assessment strategies with lots of RTOs. But then having done that, stick to the assessment plan. But you might need to make sure that the student understands that in the context of the plan, if in fact there's a deviation from the plan, maybe, for example, you've offered adjustment to a particular student, that you explain that as well. That fundamentally the plan is how you intend to assess. It guarantees the student has an opportunity to demonstrate competence, but it's not the only way. And for a student who needs an adjustment, then it's legitimate. Quite often you'll get students who appeal, not because they're unhappy with their assessment, but they're unhappy with you assessing another student in a different way. And that can be understood so long as they understand that competency-based assessment requires all students to demonstrate the same competency, but may involve different assessment strategies. So that enables you then to respond to individual assessment needs. If the students understand that the competency is not individualised, that is, everybody has to achieve the same competency. They may, in fact, demonstrate competency in slightly different ways. They have the opportunity to suggest to you as an assessor that there might be different ways. So, for example, an individual might be in a workplace, might be doing a job through which they can demonstrate competency. Workplaces are brilliant places for assessment to take place because that's where competencies naturally live. So you might then assess that student not through a set of performance assessments in class, but you might be assessing that student in the workplace, and that way you're responding to their assessment needs and assessment opportunities. You might also respond through reasonable adjustment, although we need to stress here again the word reasonable means that it must not invalidate the assessment or invalidate the unit of competency. And so, for example, if the skill requires some work to be done in writing, you can't just replace that by something done orally, because that would mean that while I demonstrated the quality on campus, they would not be able to perform the competency in the workplace. That would not be a reasonable adjustment. But that's handled elsewhere. There is a fact sheet on reasonable adjustment, which you could look at as well. There's also, I might say, a fact sheet on responding to individual needs, which covers both assessment and training, and you could look at that as well when it comes to this kind of issue. And then finally, responding promptly to learner complaints. That basically means that before it becomes a formal appeal, can you actually deal with the complaint before it reaches that level of demand? And indeed, I suspect that that's what's happening a lot these days. Very rarely as an auditor do I see, I always see an appeals process, but rarely do I see it's actually been doing anything, because people have been doing these things, creating proper plans, explaining things to the students, getting the students to agree to the plan, sticking to the plan, responding to individual needs and explaining how you can do that to other students, and responding promptly to learner complaints. Then under those circumstances, the actual formal appeals processes are less likely to be required. So legitimate grounds for appeal then are, and this is, if we go beyond the informal processes that you might implement before or encourage before a formal appeals process, is that they could disagree with the assessment plan. And look, this might mean that the student says, okay, I'm demonstrating these competencies on a day-by-day basis in the workplace. Why do I have to do these assessments when you can look at what I'm doing in the workplace? They may disagree with your demand that they be assessed in a certain way because that's what's convenient. You need to try to be flexible, and note that one of the principles of assessment is flexibility and another one is fairness. So fundamentally, principles of assessment already tell us that the student has a right to expect you to be flexible and fair. Always being valid, mind you, so that if you look at what evidence you can gather from the workplace and decide that it can't be valid, then that basically means that you can't be flexible and fair. You are going to have to be more rigid and in your requirements, because the workplace, for some reason or other, is not going to provide you with evidence that you need. It might be too remote. It might be that the person's working on their own, and therefore there's no observer that you can bring into play. There's all sorts of reasons why the evidence that exists may not be usable. It's a bit like playing golf on your own. If you're playing golf on your own and you get a hole in one, it didn't happen. It only happens if there's someone there to observe it. And so some assessment plans are necessary because other forms of evidence are simply not accessible and cannot be necessarily trusted as credible. Then the second thing could be perceived variation from the agreed plan. They may agree with the plan, but if you vary from the agreed plan, or if it's perceived that you've varied from the agreed plan, that can be the basis of an appeal. And again, I need to stress here that can often be because you've varied from the agreed plan to make an adjustment for someone else who needs and is entitled to a reasonable adjustment. It needs to be shared with your group of cohort of students because they will otherwise be aggrieved by your adjustment for someone else. They may think of it as you being lenient. Always make sure that they understand that you're not being lenient. What you're doing is accepting that competency can be demonstrated in other ways that are legitimate and reasonable. They may dispute the evidence. They may dispute the evidence gatherer. They may dispute the evidence that's been gathered. They may dispute the relevance of it, and they may dispute the judgment that you've made on the basis of evidence. So all of these are legitimate grounds for making an assessment appeal. And Standard 6, which is our next slide, summarises for us what our appeal system needs to look for. And I might say, by the way, that quite often when I look at RTOs, their appeals process is, to a large extent, a reflection of Standard 6. And why not? That's not a bad thing to do. If Standard 6 says this is what an assessment appeals process should look like. I might say, by the way, that Standard 6 also talks about complaints and appeals, and we're talking about assessment today. So we're talking about assessment appeals primarily, and which might lead ultimately to a reassessment or a reappraisal of the evidence to make a different judgment. Whatever we are doing, it must be well publicised. So we need to make sure that they understand that they have a right to appeal. Again and again, I'm finding more and more RTOs are putting this in the preamble for each assessment tool. So it'll be a dot point in the preamble of information for students which will say something along the lines, if you're not happy with the assessment, you have a right to appeal. It's prompt. By that I mean particularly because the appeal might have an effect on whether they go on to the next unit of competency or even whether they stay within the qualification in the course. It needs to be prompt. It's not something you can put off. It needs to be accessible so that there needs to be a sense in which they have quick access to an appeals process, not something which has all sorts of barriers. It's transparent and evidence-based. Transparent basically means that there are no secretive processes going on, and that, like the assessment itself, it is evidence-based, not based on opinion, but based on evidence. It offers a hearing to all parties, and the parties include the assessor and obviously the student. But if the student is complaining or appealing in relation to another, then that person has a right to be involved as well. It's impartial, so it needs to be evidence-based and disinterested. I don't mean uninterested, I mean disinterested, in the sense that the judgment is made in an impartial way. It's well documented so that the evidence and coming in is documented. The process of analysis of the evidence is documented, and the judgment and decision is documented. It can be externally reviewed because it is documented, but also you provide the individual applicant or appellant to the right to have an external engagement in order to validate, if you like, the judgment that's been made, and leads to timely and constructive outcomes. And those outcomes could include, of course, reflection on your assessment processes. In other words, an assessment appeal could be something that will trigger, for example, an assessment validation under clauses 1.9 through to 1.11. It may also may trigger a review under standard 2.2, which looks at compliance with standard 1 and your quality assurance processes. So your appeals process should connect in, particularly assessment appeals, to clause standards 1.9 through to 1.11, which relates to assessment validation, and also connect into standard 2.2, which relates to your continuous improvement process. And it may well be that you need to go back to the previous slide and say, well, those sorts of things, like information for students and explanation of what competency-based assessment and so on is, that may all be the sort of things that you need to fix and review and fix as a consequence of an appeal. So we need to think of appeals processes in a positive way. And so if the appeal process leads to dissatisfaction on part of the appellant, then they have a right to appeal to an external party, and that should be part of your appeals policy and procedure, such as the Training Accreditation Council itself. It may be that what you need to do is to reshape student expectations. Maybe they did not understand the principles that underpinned your assessment process. So that is that part of that process of being transparent. We're not dealing in the case of competency-based assessment with secretive processes. When I used to work in the university sector, we obviously kept all our assessments secret because we didn't want our students to get an unfair advantage in relation to assessment. In the vet sector, we keep nothing secret. The standards that you have to demonstrate are publicly available on the web because they are the units of competency. Even the assessment processes are in the assessment requirements of the unit of competency. So that everything the student needs to know about assessment is there. So we need to make sure that they are fully aware of either the actual information itself or where the information can be obtained, so that they have proper expectations. And then, of course, we've already talked about them understanding what competency-based assessment is with respect to the unit of competency, and sharing with them the assessment plans that we have through a learning and assessment plan or a learning and assessment strategy document of some kind. So by making sure students have proper expectations, we can minimise appeals. And if there is an appeal, we may ask ourselves the question, is part of the problem our problem in that we didn't inform the students properly? It may, of course, be that the appeal is totally justified and that error has been made, in which case reassessment will need to be involved. I need to stress here that an appeal should not lead to a judgment of competent. Basically, what it would mean is a reassessment, which could lead to a judgment of competency. You can't turn a bit of evidence of incompetence into evidence of competence through an appeals process. What you might decide is we have to suspend judgment, get new evidence, make a proper judgment. And of course, as I've just been saying before, the appeal process should feed into our quality assurance processes, standard 2.2 and clauses 1.9 through 1.11, our assessment validation process. And surprise, surprise, there is a TAC fact sheet on RTO complaints and appeals, which you can follow up with. So there we're going to finish for today, unless you have any particular questions you want to ask, but I just draw your attention on this screen to the fact that there are a whole lot of resources. There's, of course, the standards for RTOs and tax users guide for the standards. And everything we've shared with you today is consistent with those standards, although not everything we shared with you today is mandated by those standards. Some of what we've shared with you today is advice, and I'm hoping I made that clear, and some of it is mandated by the standards. So wherever that was necessary, we've cross-referenced it to the particular standard. And then there are the fact sheets. Tax fact sheets are an extraordinary resource. And of course, if you're not working with TAC as your regulator, these are resources you can use. They're not likely to be inconsistent with ASQA, but that does not mean that you should not check ASQA's own position on these things. So look at these things and look at what ASQA produces and make a judgment, a professional judgment as to how you can work best. But for those of you who are working with TAC as your regulator, this is advice from TAC. Sometimes it's mandated and it'll be referenced to the standards. Sometimes it's advice in terms of good practice. So there's one on assessment. There's another one on assessment validation. There's another yet on records management, one on RTO complaints and appeals, one on industry engagement. And that is referred to here because the judgment you're making is saying this person is industry ready. And that judgment can only be made if you know what industry expects. So industry engagement is a means by which you do that. And standard 1.6 talks about industry engagement impacting on the content and structure of your training and assessment strategies as part of making sure that they're relevant to industry requirements. So it's a fact sheet is relevant to your expertise as an assessor. Likewise, vocational competence and industry currency has the same sort of function. Identifying and meeting learner needs is a fact sheet which reminds us that we need to be flexible and fair when it comes to assessment, principles of assessment there. And this talks about how you can identify and meet learner needs and the boundaries and limits to what you can do, because overall you still need to be valid in your compliance with the unit requirements. And there's a fact sheet on the amount of training. And the amount of training is basically saying that there's a quantum of learning that a student needs to do. Some RTOs include assessment in the amount of training because it's part of the process. Others don't. It's your choice. But fundamentally, the amount of training talks about the kind of level of engagement of a student in relation to training and, if you choose, assessment. So what we have is a body of resources in the provided by TAC. These can be looked at digitally from the TAC website, and you can download them and print them out in colourful documents of this kind, and we draw your attention to those resources. And finally, we take the opportunity to draw your attention to the 3rd of May, which may seem like a long way away, but we're going to deal with a short workshop, a short webinar on assessment validation. And in lots of ways, of course, that provides closure to the sequence of 4, because it's basically going to reflect back on all the things we dealt with, designing an assessment system, developing assessment tools, making the assessment decision. All of those need to be validated as part of the process of validation. It will look at clause 1.8 because validity is both a principle of assessment and a different kind of validity is a rule of evidence. And it's also going to look at assessment validation in relation to clauses 1.9 through to 111. And then how the validation itself, like the appeals, then feeds back into your continuous improvement process, which is clause 2.2. So what we can see here is a kind of way of achieving both a reflection on the things we've already done in this series, but also achieving closure, but also achieving a sense of security that what we're doing is going to work. So hopefully we'll get to see you on the 3rd of May. Do you have any questions you want to put to us now? You can. Otherwise, we refer you here to the TAC contacts. TAC is always happy to hear from you, both about this workshop itself or about issues raised in this workshop. So feel free to take advantage of TAC's accessibility through this process. Thank you very much for being with us today. I'm happy to stay a bit here if there are any questions you want to put. Otherwise, I'll see you back. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Russell, for your presentation, and also to everyone for your participation. A recording of the session and the handouts will be available on the TAC website and also on TAC's YouTube channel. A certificate of attendance and a short survey will also be emailed to you in the coming week. Thank you very much.
If I can get the last word in, can I also say thank you, Mel, for all that you've done in working with this. It's been very, very valuable.
No worries. Thanks, Russell.